This is the Future Talk. From risk to resilience, mobilizing business to tackle inequality and deliver shared prosperity. Please welcome to the stage Gabriela Ramos from the Taskforce on Inequalities and Social Financial Disclosure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us in this session. I know that it has been very active conference, and I want to call on my panelists to come and join us because we have only 40 minutes and we're going to be taking advantage of it. First, I want to call on Katharina Stasch, Director General for Global Alliances, European Union Economic Cooperation at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. I caught your breath, so please. Yes, an applause, please. We have Mr. Kinyanjui, who is Cabinet Minister, Minister of Investments, Trade and Industry from Kenya. Thank you, Minister. We have our dear John Denton, the Secretary General. Denton, great to have you, John. Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce. And we also have Cambria Allen-Ratzlaff, the Interim Chief Executive Officer for Principles for Responsible Investments. And we also have our CEO, Simon Robson, who is here with us. He will be intervening from the floor. So the question is very straightforward. We have seen it in the Hamburg conference. Inequality and the concerns about inequalities, the impact on inequality is rising all over the world. We have the data. We have seen how the concentration of wealth, how the concentration of opportunities is really not only a social concern, it's an economic and a financial one. And market actors are recognizing it. That if inequality continues increasing in the way it has done, is not only be a social source of discontent, is also going to be a threat to the stability of the financial system, is going to reduce the quality of growth, is going to reduce productivity, is going to reduce markets. And I feel that the ultimate thing is going to reduce trust in institutions. We are seeing that happening. And therefore, I feel that is great that we have you here to discuss these issues, but also from the perspective of the Task Force on Inequalities and Social Financial Disclosure, which is the initiative that I am co-chairing, that is looking on how to engage businesses to bring this perspective and to understand how inequalities is shaping their opportunities and also their performance. It is also an issue of global discussions. The Financing for Development agenda, including the Sevilla commitment, calls for a stronger alignment between public and private finance to support shared prosperity. Under Brazil and South Africa G20 presidency in 2024 and 2025, respectively, inequality was brought to the center of the international financial considerations. And the World Economic Forum and 2025 Global Risk Report noted that CEOs across 121 countries identified inequality among the top 10 global risks for the next decade. So we have this perspective, we have the issues, we have how this construct is, of course, private to the government's role, but it also calls for the business sector to chip in. And I have to say, having been also exposed to the question of climate change, climate became an issue that could have been tackled when it became a financial and an economic issue. It was always an environmental one. But then when finance ministers chip in, it became something that could be systemic and that had to be tackled in a very different way, including for the environmental perspective. And therefore, also this one is social, but it's also economic. So I would like to start bringing Katharina with us, because you have been engaging in multilateral development policies with private sector investment and international development partnerships. So for you, I know inequality is not only a domestic issue. It shapes the way development cooperation is also informed in Germany. And we also want to thank you for your support. And therefore, you have the floor to tell us how this is integrated into your strategic thinking and how you're tackling it.
Thank you very much. And indeed, inequalities are very real, and you tackled on a couple of examples, and I want to highlight again some figures which are really devastating. Two-thirds of the persons in the world live in countries where income inequalities are on the rise. And you mentioned also climate, and it's well known that the wealthy 10% are responsible for 1/2 of the global CO2 emissions. And I think this is very clear that something has to change. And indeed, fighting inequalities is one of the priorities of the BMZ, of German development policies. We are just coming out of a huge reform process where we said we need to focus more. We do have 4 priorities, and the first and foremost priority is fighting poverty and fighting inequalities. So what does this mean concretely? And let me also say, inequalities is not a challenge dedicated to certain regions. It's also in my own country, and we experience it in these days where the heads of government actually meet in order to look at the possibility of reform. So it's something we're in there together. It's also something we do, as I said, with our development policy. So very concretely, when it comes, for instance, to the economic sphere, we say we will help those countries who ask us to do so to have fair and transparent tax systems. We are also fostering economic development, because economic development very often is the key to have more equality also in a society. And I know that some of you are just coming from another session where the Global Alliance Against Inequality was the main topic. And indeed, we are a founding member of this alliance. And I'm very happy to hear that just today we welcomed a number of new members. And this is also part of how we engage, because we only can do it together with others in partnerships. And we're very much looking forward to the 2027 SDG Summit and the High-Level Policy Forum, where we can advance our work also in that alliance.
And it's great, actually, that we are in Hamburg, because we will be quoting you. We will be quoting Germany as a very great place where these discussions happened. I also want to call on Minister Kinyanjui. And it's interesting because you are in charge of investment. You are in charge of access to finance. You are in charge of promoting the business environment in Kenya. And definitely, it's an international agenda too. And how these inequalities in the global context are also shaping the capacities of countries in Africa like yours to access the capital, to access the skill, to access all of those issues that you need to advance economic development and progress.
Thank you. Thank you, and allow me to take this opportunity, of course, to thank the task force for the good work. And I think also to submit that maybe for a long time our focus on judging economic growth has largely been on the per capita, on the GDP, and as long as the GDP is good and the per capita is good, then those fundamentals would show that the country is doing well. But increasingly, there is a need for us to focus on inequalities, because the GDP could be rising or the per capita could be good, but only to a few, yet at the cost of the bigger majority. Us and countries within the global south, I think the issue of inequality is of great manifest, and I think we need to find ways in which we can be able to deal with this issue. In the case of Kenya, I want to start by maybe saying that no company, private sector, can have a higher rating than its own country. So typically in the international market, countries will be judged, and upon that, their access to credit will be defined by that rating. And therefore, as a private sector within that country, you cannot rise beyond the classification of your particular country. So the first challenge we face is that in the rating of our nations, there has been an overstatement of the risk factor, resulting in expensive credits for governments to supply or meet its basic needs of governance and other costs. But I think most significantly is that cost has actually been made by persons or entities outside that space. So, for example, if you look at the rating agencies that give country ratings, many of them have no location in the countries where they rate, yet their ratings affect significantly how those countries operate from that particular point. Of note, therefore, is that credit to those countries tends to be higher and inordinately expensive. And for that reason, also to say that risk factors within our countries also tend to be exaggerated. On the business side, I think it's also good to note that when government spending is high and the cost of finance is high, especially external finance, it means also there's an increase in internal lending, the cost of lending also internally. And therefore, they compete with the business people. And it is obvious that normally governments will get first preference before the businesses get. We have been battling with this question of available money in the economy. Everybody goes to buy treasury bonds and treasury bills. Therefore, businesses don't have capital to be able to expand. And that therefore leads to greater inequalities that later on make it difficult for businesses to grow. Employment creation becomes low, and general stagnation in the well-being and growth of the businesses become evident. Worth noting also is that companies that are in manufacturing and are in the global space will be competing with other companies from other regions across the world. So if you are competing and your source of capital is, say, 15 to 16%, and you're competing with another company whose source of capital is 3 or 4 or 5%, then it means that your cost of production, even before we go to anything else, will obviously be higher. And therefore, you're outpriced in the market. And this therefore leads to inability to access certain markets, and obviously, in the long run, making sure that our goods are not able to access the bigger market. So the issue of access to credit and its implication in the competitiveness of companies within our region obviously becomes a very big issue in market access, and also ensuring that the products are able to compete favorably to other global markets. Lastly also is within the private sector lending, there's the issue of how small scale or SMEs are branded, and in many cases, the perceptions around the risk factor when it comes to SMEs. And this is really nearly 60 to 70% of the businesses in most of our economies. And when banks have an option to lend between a big corporate and an SME that is perceived to be risky, they would rather go to the big corporate. And therefore, this again leads to the perpetuation of the very same inequalities that we would otherwise have wanted to do. What has been done in the past is to try and come up with sort of a classification or quotas within which this percent must go to this sector. We've even had a situation where certain banks have been branded as SME banks to specifically deal with that categorization, and that has really been of great help. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And maybe because we are always with our own activities, priorities, and I am the co-chair of this task force of inequalities and social financial disclosure, we think that everybody knows what we're doing. The reality is that by listening to the minister, we are trying to equate what the climate reporting did, but for inequalities. And we're working with a multi-stakeholder alliance of course, of governments, of civil society, of businesses, and translating what businesses need to report might be easier when it relates to what business do in their companies in terms of wages, in terms of support, in terms of value chains, in terms of human rights. is more complicated when we look at the financial system and the systemic risks that you mentioned, the access to capital, the way the financial system behaves, who is rewarded, who is granted, and all of those things I feel is super important. And therefore, this conversation will help the task force to advance our work that actually needs to be delivered in 2027, not a minor thing. And therefore, I'm very glad to bring you to the conversation, John, because you represent the CEOs, you represent the business sector, you represent multinational companies, but we have also talked to a lot of business people and CEOs that recognize that inequality poses a risk. And therefore, I want you to bring into this conversation, what do you see as the major concerns of these actors in terms of market stability, in terms of financial stability, and how would you recommend this to be tackled in a way that is, of course, it's not heavy because business don't want heavy reporting, but that needs to be tackled?
Well, great to be with you. Just a bit of context. So the International Chamber of Commerce, we're actually in 170 countries, 70% in the Global South. In fact, we're honoured to have Patrick Abath from Kenya on our executive board. In fact, almost 30% of our executive board comes from Africa these days. We enable $17.5 trillion worth of economic activity, and we represent more than 50 million businesses. So they're not all large, they're not all small. We're actually, in a way, size neutral. Our job is to represent the private sector. It's actually quite ironic that I'm speaking on the subject of inequality here in Germany. When I first took on the leadership role at ICC, I thought things had to change because I think, in a way, institutions can rest on their laurels, but the reality is, what are the actual needs of the business community in the 21st century? So I went about the task of transforming the ICC into what I think is a purpose-led, mission-driven organisation. Our purpose is to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. And I launched in Germany at the annual meeting of ICC Germany, and we had like all the biggies. We had chambers and that sort of stuff. And I said, of course, as part of that, we have to identify the risks to the functioning of the private sector. Settings which enable an open market and freedom of movement of goods across borders are not a God-given right. We actually have to earn the right with the citizenship to actually have that. It's not a God-given right. So we need to do something about it. So I launched 5 campaigns. One of the campaigns I launched, this is more than 6 years ago, was to stop the rise in global inequality. I was attacked from the floor for introducing socialism into the ICC and for bringing a perspective, because at one time in my life I worked in Moscow, of communism into the ICC, which is the bastion of the private sector. And in a way, I kind of laughed. I said, you guys have got to be joking. Do you see what will happen? Can't you look beyond yourself and see what will happen because of the rise of inequality? It will actually lead to a removal of what you think is your God-given right to an open market. There will be interference in a way that you will not anticipate. So we need to do something about it. It's interesting because when I was back 2 years ago, everyone was saying, yes, that's so good you did that. It's so good we're doing that. It's exactly right, because it really affects our supply chains. I'm not saying that I'm a future pundit, but you could see it. Of course it has an issue for businesses. Of course it actually affects the environment in which we operate, because we don't set that environment. It's actually set by the body politic, and politicians respond to signals from their electorate. And if the electorate doesn't feel they're getting a fair deal, I'm Australian, you're not getting a fair mouthful, then there's going to be a response. There's going to be inhibitions placed on businesses. And frankly, it's in the interests of business, therefore, to look at these issues. Look, I got to tell you, I also sit on a number of boards of companies. I'm still a business person as well. I have business interests. This morning I was on a subcommittee of the board I'm on, which is a very large infrastructure investment company. And I'm on the responsible investment subcommittee. And we're a $300 billion fund, so we're not a small player, and we own assets. And we are actually subject to a number of competing regulatory frameworks because we're global. We're in Germany, we're in Latin America, we're all over the place. But one thing that we're trying to do is ensure that we're complying with the obligations for reporting. And it's complicated and it's onerous, and frankly, a lot of it is not well thought through, but the underlying principle is reasonable. You need transparency. You need accountability, because you need to ensure the incentives for the business operators are aligned to the strategic objectives. And that is for us to be able to continue to operate and function as a business. And if we're not paying attention to things that will inhibit that, or we're not measuring and accountable for that, then as an infrastructure investor, we won't be welcome to your country. We want more opportunities, and by actually being able to show that not only are we rhetorically committed, that we are doing these things, it can make a difference. It can actually, and does, make us a preferred partner for significant investments when countries seek to allocate to the private sector a share of their national treasure, which is their infrastructure. So it's really important to us. And I put it that way because, as I recall, 6 or 7 years ago, it was actually not in Hamburg, because Hamburg would never treat me like that, but it was in Berlin. I recall, and I went back and I spoke to some of those business people, and most of them have either lost their jobs now because they failed to move with the times, but they reflect on the reality that the minister mentioned and the secretary mentioned as well, that the times have changed. You cannot just trust people. There needs to be accountability and there needs to be action. And part of that is, I think, the good work you guys are doing. I'm not as familiar with it as I'd like to be, but we sound like we're aligned, Gabriela, which is good. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And that's why we love to have you there, John. Keep on talking about communism.
I'm
kidding. I'm kidding. No, the reality is that the evidence, the way we frame things, the narrative needs to be shared and needs to be understood. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop a narrative that is completely evidence-based, that could tell businesses why they have these risks, why they have this impact, and how they can tackle it in their financial...
But I'm just going to add one thing. But we want to ensure we are profitable.
Yep.
Profit drives innovation. But we just need to ensure that we understand.
Profitable
that's right. But we need to make certain that the frameworks understand that need as well.
You know me. I come from the economic world, and I know how important it is to be productive and profitable, but also how important it is to ensure that the benefits of growth are not so skewly distributed as they are today. And therefore, this is the part why we work with businesses to really get it right, but also we need the civil society, the unions, and the governments. And then with this perspective, you come very timely. Yes. My dear Cambria,
the capital.
Because at the end, you are the capital.
Yes.
And let me tell you that these big investors that are allocating capital and that are actually in one way or the other, like you mentioned, Secretary, the question of defining the priorities, nothing defines better the priorities than allocating capital. And I remember when BlackRock said, I will not invest in companies that don't have representation of women, the market moved. And therefore, I want to ask you how you see investors changing this conversation, thinking about how to integrate the impact on people and the outcomes for people in their decision-making for investment tools.
Sure. No, thank you. And that's exactly it, right? So PRI, we are a global group of over 5,000, we call them signatories, but these are large institutional investors, including asset owners, investment managers, representing about 140 trillion in US. capital. So for investors, they also have to earn a risk-adjusted return. And inequality is not just a social issue for them with a financial footnote. It's something that absolutely impacts their ability to earn those returns on the systems level, and then there's also the company level piece. So TISFD, which we are a proud supporter and founding supporter, breaks risk down into 3 interconnected channels, which I think is right? So we societal stability risk, which is something that we've been discussing, macroeconomic risk, and financial stability risk. And for universal owners, so you're thinking about your sovereign wealth funds, your pension funds, your insurers, each of these translates into portfolio-wide risk because we invest in a society, we invest in a construct, and if there are risks in that construct, that impacts returns. So on the societal stability risk side, you have increasing political polarization, which leads to policy volatility. And those types of things are already priced by investors through higher discount rates. So some of this that we're talking about are tools that investors are already using. We're just thinking about them in a slightly different way. Social unrest, you have reduction in economic activity that hits supply chains, hits commodity prices, hits inflation. And so these run through channels investors already model. Second, on the macroeconomic risk side, that comes through weaker productivity, innovation, and demand, and that is key at the country level. That's the capacity, that's your human capital. It erodes your human capital and excludes people who might have wonderful talents to contribute. So you're basically underusing your population. And that constrains all 3 of those: productivity, innovation, and demand. So OECD, for example, estimated that growth in the US, UK, and Germany would have been about a 5th higher if not for inequality increasing between 1990 and 2010. And then financial stability. I think the IMF kind of frames this quite well. So rising household debt might buy you about 3 to 5 years of growth, but then you go in the opposite direction. So slower growth, higher crisis probability, that becomes worse in advanced economies. So mechanism is distributional. So excess savings at the top, credit at the bottom, and that creates an explosive situation. We saw that in the 2008 financial crisis, where there was a lot of inequality kind of lingering under the surface. People looked at the markets, oh, things are great, and they weren't great. And then you have on I'll just talk about a couple of risks at the company or asset level. Below living wage doesn't remove cost. That shows up in turnover. It shows up in things like lost productivity, shows up in retraining. And it's harder to see because it's lost in our accounting system, which doesn't really value our credit companies for spending on those things. And then that doesn't get attributed back to the wage decision. You have wages stagnate, and then we go again. And then you also have legal liability risks. So as more countries are focusing on improving labor laws, if your company is built and has been benefiting for poor labor standards, that shows up as well. Mispricing, economy eventually will correct that. So these are areas that investors care about. Inequality is undiversifiable, it's systemic, and it's still unpriced. And so we need better tools to be able to do that.
And it's great to have her also in the task force with all these very, very concrete analysis. And I think that the way you put the question of how investors are considering all these elements to, of course, deliver and get the results that you want, link very nicely with our minister, because the question is not just to have investments, just to attract capital. You want to have those investments and those partnerships that are actually part of the Sevilla commitments and to the SDGs that will deliver quality jobs, that will deliver inclusive growth, and that would really bring the economies in a sustainable development path. So what are those issues that Kenya is really looking for when thinking about investment?
Oh, thank you. I think for Kenya, we are very outward looking in the last couple of years, trying to attract investment. But I think, as has been said, it's also good to attract investment in the right sectors, and also to ensure that even as they come, they will be able to address some of the inequalities that we have seen, especially in employment. I think the first one is a reporting structure, so that from time to time, companies will want to report how their performance has been, and an indicator of how equality or inequality is being addressed, and the internal policies that can be put in place would be one of the ways that we can be able to track this. I want also to confirm that, especially for our agricultural sector, it is one of the requirements for export. I think we call it fair trade or something, and it ensures that there's a bit of equality, and that the processes under which some of those commodities are produced adhere to the inequality parameters that would otherwise be essential. We also are looking at the possibilities and working on how we can have inclusive supply chains. Also when you look at the global supply chains, we find that most of it, if you have to look at the auto industry, there's very little being done from the continent. So again, attracting the big supply chains, whether we are talking about textile and others, because we also believe that when a region has been excluded from the value chain and just becomes a market, it is a way of perpetuating the inequalities at a global or national level that would otherwise want to do that. In connection to value addition, we are also looking at some of our core commodities, such as coffee, tea, and others that are otherwise exported raw. And we believe that as long as some of our products, core exports, are exported raw, then it is also a way of exporting the jobs and also thereby increasing the inequalities that we have. Therefore, we are working on specific modalities of attracting value addition at home and also creating tax incentives to ensure that that is done. And finally, is opening up markets within our region, and in this particular case, the East Africa community, the Africa Free Trade Area, is a way of encouraging local markets to build wealth, to bring employment, and other measures. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would ask you to react to that, my dear.
Yes, I will happily. And
because the whole point is that with Germany, we have worked for many years, but particularly in the task force, to create these enabling environments for investments to contribute to sustainable growth. And of course, you know how we work because you have been supporting the task force. And how do you think that the work we are doing to define this narrative, these metrics, these issues, to understand the drivers and the elements there will contribute to this more sustainable investment and enabling environment for business?
Yes, thank you. And also, first of all, thanks a lot for the tremendous work the task force is doing and important work, of course. And these days we talk a lot about how to engage the private sector, how to get the business to do the investments. And the Hamburg Sustainability Conference is really about getting into action and being very concrete. I would like to comment on what you said in your first intervention, which was that the risk factor is overstated by certain entities like rating agencies. And I think this is exactly one point which is super important and which we need to tackle together with you. How can we work on a fair risk assessment in order to enable companies to actually have a good way to assess the risk? Number two is on the data and transparency. And also here, we are getting concrete here in Hamburg with the Hamburg Data Coalition. And the third point is on standards. And standards is about less transaction costs. Yesterday, we launched Scaled, which is in a blended finance vehicle. It's really about standardization. We have a couple of governments. We do have big institutional investors creating that new vehicle that smaller investors can trust. For instance, they don't have to reassess the risk-return ratio on their own, but they can trust that the big ones already did it. And also, when we talk about standards, it's something we launched at our G7 presidency. It's the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is really working well. Same thing, reducing transaction cost by having a global standard on the reporting. Now, you mentioned it and you also mentioned it, investment is not a goal in itself, but it's really about adding local value. And in the World Bank, we talk a lot about creating jobs. Yes, but it's not only about creating jobs, it's about creating decent jobs. And this is a conversation we have a lot also with the ILO and of course also with you and others. And added value can also mean a green transformation. And I think this is really nice and you can see how everything goes hand in hand. And when I mentioned at the beginning, we reformed our development policy and I said we have 4 priorities. And the first priority is fighting inequalities. I can tell you the third priority is fostering economic cooperation and development. And this really neatly goes hand in hand, and the Taskforce is one proof of it.
Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes and 2 fantastic speakers. So I really want you to take just 2, each one of you. I know the questions are too broad, but very concretely, how are businesses thinking, John, about their impact on people, workers, on the inequalities, on the perspectives, on the value chains, and how a task force like ours can help you get them together and have a common language.
Thanks, Gabriela. To be frank, I'm not certain about the latter, because I need to understand a bit more about the approach of the task force, though I'm really delighted to hear how open you are to engaging with business. I mean, when I listened to the minister speak before, though, if I can just comment on that, and also to the secretary, one of the most important things, frankly, with the collapse of development assistance is to recognise that the economic opportunities will not be development assistance-led, they're going to have to be private sector-led. And private sector-led is not just about investment, it's actually about increasing economic activity. And when we talk about jobs, there is also the reality that there may not be jobs. So what we also have to do is create an enabling environment for people to start their own businesses, to be entrepreneurs. I don't mean unicorns, creators, or startup dudes. This is actually about people becoming hairdressers in refugee camps, people actually setting up a side store in the street in which they live. Got to make it as easy as possible for them to do. That's increasing economic activity. The other thing is to actually create sustainable economic activity, and often it's creating the opportunity for SMEs to trade across borders. The most sustainable businesses are ones that trade across borders, but in Africa, less than 3% do. In Latin America, it's about 2%. Think of the untapped economic activity or opportunity. So what we are doing, we created as part of the South African G20 legacy, we have a centre of entrepreneurship which operates globally. We're creating trade corridors and taking and building business models to help people go across borders. I was talking to Ajay at the World Bank. Ajay used to be the chair of the ICC. These are not pilots. Stop doing pilots. We need to actually do projects which are capable of global scaling. So that's what we're doing. And because we have integrity and because we have a platform already, that's what we offer. So that's something we're doing, by the way, in Kenya. And maybe that's something Germany might be interested in supporting.
We work with business, but Simon, we will need to work more with John. Because
you'll have enough of me after this.
I think you have also what it takes. I completely agree with you. We need to foster businesses. We need to support. We need to really address the bottlenecks. But we also need to look at the other side of the equation, which is the distribution of the benefits of growth and how businesses also contribute to ensure that the economic system is not as completely unequal as it is now, which is actually preventing more people to have access to financing, to do their own businesses. All of these things, I think, come together, and this is what we're trying to do. And then Cambria, I think is very important that you tell us how can we help you to translate these into something that makes sense, that brings what we have heard from the panel, the need to advance economic prosperity, the need to ensure that investments and development go to the right places, the need to have business people to the business environment, but we need also the metrics, we need the narratives, we need the tools. So how can we help you?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question. I'll do this quickly. Really investors need good information and they need to know how to use it into price so they can make decisions. That's the biggest thing. And investors are already using quite a few tools already, things like due diligence, integration, stewardship. For example, PRI has its Advance initiative, which has grown to $30 trillion US dollars represented. But so the desire's there. It's the execution where there's a challenge, right? So decision useful data, that's great. TISFD is working to bring that to a close. So we're thinking about impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities related to people. But the data is necessary, not necessarily sufficient. So better disclosure into a system that doesn't know how to best integrate that and understand it, that's where we have the gap. So we think about things like accounting, for example. That's a really, really big one. And human capital investment sits largely outside of the accounting framework. So for example, the way that we treat physical capital, which can be an asset, which the balance sheet captures, and then you have human capital, which gets lost, that could skew decision-making. And that asymmetry is going to become even more important as we move into things like AI. So we need the data, we need the tools, but we also need those systems to be able to understand it properly.
And we are taking note. This is a very complex conversation. I think I tried to put everybody in the same page. I think that we now understand that we're working to try to support businesses, understand the impact on inequalities in their own processes, in their own value chains, but also in terms of the economic systems. We, of course, count on governments because governments are the ones that provide the frameworks and the policy decisions. But I just want to say that you should be watching this space because we will continue working on the task force with our members. And that's why I want to give, with the permission of the organizers, 1 minute to Simon Rawson, who is the CEO of the task force, who will tell us how we are going to address all these problems.
Okay. You didn't tell me that was the question. Firstly, huge thanks to the panel, to Gabriela as our co-chair, cabinet secretary, and panelists. Very grateful for your remarks. And John, don't worry, I have a copy of the framework here for you to take away and read on the plane home. I heard very reassuring remarks that business is realizing that the risks of inequality are real and material. I heard about the importance of creating transparency so that the data is there, that ratings can be fair, and that starts with fair, true and accurate, true and fair data. And then lastly, maybe referring to John's point and yours, Gabriela, I want to talk for a second about the way that we're building the framework. So it is an inclusive and co-creative process. The current draft, which is our first, we call it a beta draft of the framework, has just been published and is open for feedback. We're actively encouraging feedback. It doesn't need to be a 30-page comment letter. You can send us one-line comments on a page, and you can do so via the website and tisfd.org and the QR code just there. And we look forward to iterating based on your feedback and developing the future versions, hopefully for the end of 2027. Do I close or do you? I want to thank the panel, and I hope you will all join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the public. I really hope that you will be engaged with this. The framework is there. The definitions are there. We really, and we have a fantastic secretariat, really trying to understand how do we translate concepts that usually belong to people's outcomes into something that is meaningful for businesses to integrate in their own decision making. Because at the end is how businesses take decisions, understanding what impact their actions and their behavior will have on people's outcomes. And therefore, thank you so much. And now we're done with the 3 minutes, but it's okay. Shall we get a picture? Shall we get a picture?